Hey everyone, so let's talk a little bit today about motherhood, but from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of men's experiences in the procreative realm, and maybe how that can help us understand motherhood a little bit better. So, first of all, we need to think about why motherhood is often framed in this really sex-gendered way, that we think of motherhood and mothering itself as within a female realm, within a woman-identified female realm, that we think of reproductive labor often in terms of this gestational model that we've mentioned before when we've talked about surrogacy and when we've discussed the getting your body back. It was really just referencing females and woman-identified females. So why is it that mothering, if mothering is really this idea of caregiving, that we often construe motherhood and mothering as this particularly female act? Is it that caregiving is feminized for reasons that have to do with gender and sex, and there's something different substantially about fathering, or that we need a different term? So, in this particular lecture, we're going to look a little bit at how there are different sex gender roles in reproductive planning and decisions, but we're also going to look a little bit at how men experience reproductive labor. And by reproductive labor here, I mean from the decision-making process of whether or not to try to have children, to try to conceive, but also we're going to preview a little bit what we'll talk about more in our discussion on masculinity, the manhood acts that go with decisions about how to mother, how to care, how to father, if you will. So, with that said, in the article, we saw this sort of complex model of the potential decision making for men who are considering fatherhood or procreation, or in this case, even just whether or not to have sex. And when we look at this, it's a really complicated set of decisions. When we think about this idea of a man-identified male considering the possibilities of sexual intercourse or desire to have a child, we don't think about, or rarely do we consider this complex decision making occurring. But they argue that really behind the scenes there's this complicated set of decision making, at least implicitly occurring. Do I want to have a child? Am I currently motivated to have a child? Is this something that I'm actively motivated to do? Is it something that I'm implicitly motivated to do? Am I interested in having intercourse right now? Am I not interested in having intercourse right now? It's a very complicated set of issues. This is all not to say that every time a man-identified male is interested in having sex, he's diagramming out the decision-making process in this elaborate way, or has some sort of app on his cell phone trying to figure out whether or not to have sex and then what subsequent decisions to make, like whether or not to use contraception. But it's this idea that it's not this straightforward, oversimplified idea that we often get from the media, right? Oftentimes, if we were to understand men's decision-making process with regard to procreation or desire to have children from the lens of mass media, something that we'll get into more in a couple of weeks in this presentation of gender through the lens of the media, we would get this really caricatured idea of how males regard the procreative process and reproductive labor. So, the frames that are often provided for the procreative decision-making process for males, we have one of the most prolific frames is this frame of avoidance, that males are either perpetually in a state of avoidance or at least most commonly in a state of avoidance. Similarly, we have this idea of the acceptance-reluctance framework. So the idea that when men are initially in avoidance, but upon finding out that a sexual partner has conceived, that they are either reluctant to be a father or they go through an acceptance period. Um, Another common frame that is more prevalent in the literature, but that we're increasingly seeing in the media, and the reading talks a little bit about this, is this idea of the preparation or desire frame. And this is a frame that is often, like we talked about in reference to the Fit Pregnancy magazine article, um, is often classed and raced. It's ethnocentric and a little bit classist in that the preparation and desire framework is often depicted as something that upper class males exhibit. So, this idea that upper class males would be monitoring their sperm counts or would be paying closer attention to their capacity. Um, when it's framed in a lower class way, there are often elements of it that caricature um, based on race and based on stereotypes. Another thing that is mentioned in the article is this frame of fostering conception. So the ways in which we might see tropes of males who are finding ways to foster the procreative process. And last but not least, this idea of anticipation. So the anticipatory father, the father anxious to have the child. And this is often framed as the father anxious for, in particular, a son. So I want to look a little bit at some of men's actual experiences with reproductive labor. And talk about what some of the major issues are. So, one of the issues is this idea of the lack of control or the control over the reproductive process. So, we should differentiate in terms of control and lack of control the experiences of individual men versus patriarchal institutions. So, in Blushtain's article, she talks a lot about the ways in which the ACOG is really taking control of the reproductive labor process out of the hands of women. And in particular, really masculizing it to the extent that the medical profession is still dominated by men. This is an example of a patriarchal institution or a male dominated institution really having control over the reproductive process. This doesn't mean that individual men have much control. And this reading really talks about the way in which individual men might have very little control. For example, in the event of a situation in which two persons, not necessarily partners, conceive, it is often the case that the male has very little control over whether or not the female decides to abort. In that situation, if he's ready to father, he might be anticipatory with regard to parenthood. If she is not, he has very little control over that situation. Regardless of how you feel about abortion, that is a way in which the individual man has very little control over the reproductive labor process. So we want to differentiate this idea of individual men lacking control, while patriarchal institutions might still have dominant control over reproductive labor in general. Now, within this, there's a lot of cultural variations and legal variability. So, in the reading, it mentioned MENA countries in which individual men do have control over abortive processes, and cultural variations in which individual men might have more or less say in the reproductive labor process. Another important thing for us to talk about with regard to men's experiences with reproductive labor are the ways that technology is changing that relationship. So, as DNA testing has become increasingly available, both in terms of its accuracy as well as its reduced cost, DNA testing has allowed men to be more sure of their paternity and has also allowed increased access to parenthood. So men have the ability both to disavow paternity but also to claim paternity. This has been helpful for men who otherwise might not have had access to their children, but also for men who might have otherwise been forced into parenthood for children who are not really genetically related to them. This harkens back to our discussions from surrogacy about what is really relevant when it comes to parenthood. Is it intention? Is it genetics? Is it lack of intent? Is it care? What is actually relevant? Well, with regard to DNA testing and males, the standard has really been genetics as far as legally in the Western world. Another important technological development with regard to men's relationship to reproductive labor process is surrogacy, and the way in which surrogacy has allowed men to gain access to genetically related children without having to have a stable female partner. So without requiring marriage or a permanent female partner, men can have a biologically related child. And for many men, this has been a boon for them because there has been historically a great deal of discrimination against single men who are interested in parenthood. And still really under development and not accessible yet, but increasing amounts of research is in the area of male hormonal contraceptives, so giving men greater control over whether or not to conceive in the first place. So the bigger, broader question here is, why talk about men and males and really man-identified males in a discussion on motherhood in general? And my point here is, well, really, what role do males and man-identified males play in our conceptualization of motherhood? We should really think about the reproductive process as gendered and sexed, but also in a non-exclusionary way. It takes more than just a single sex to create life. And it also takes a community to define these roles. So, in what ways do we define motherhood? Is it necessary to define it based on gender and sex? And if it does, how do males and man-identified males in particular help us to conceptualize motherhood? Things for you all to think about, which is how I end most of these lectures. See you all next time.